You ever read something that gives you just a whole bunch of deja vu from all sorts of positions, yet at face value it should have nothing to do with any of those things? That's kind of what happened with me and British Leyland. They were a car manufacturer, over in Britain, obviously, but their story kind of reminds me of things like Penn Central, which is bad. They didn't crash quite as quick or for the same reasons, though they were notoriously mismanaged, to the point that the British government had to step in and effectively nationalize them to try to keep them afloat, and even that didn't really work. They would become infamous for their failure, though they did actually have a few decent cars and successes over their life. Regardless of what you personally think of them, their story is definitely interesting and worth discussing. Originally known as British Leyland Motor Corporation Limited, or BLMC, they were founded on January 17, 1968, through a merger. Already we're thinking of Penn Central, I know. The merger was between British Motor Holdings, or BMH, and Leyland Motor Corporation, LMC. Now the latter of these, Leyland, was actually very well known over in England as a manufacturer of things like lorries, buses, as well as trolley buses. They specialized in commercial vehicles, though they had acquired other brands like Triumph and Rover during the 1960s. They were in pretty good shape at the time, but their merged partner, British Motor Holdings, wasn't quite like that. They were very large and had a lot of different brands under their roster like Jaguar, and technically they were just a holding company, and it only existed for a couple years at that point. The reason the merger went ahead at all was due to the British government. They wanted it, which is unusual and the opposite of Penn Central, where New York Central and the Pennsy had to fight tooth and nail to get their merger to go through, and then when it did, it was a disaster. In this instance, between these car manufacturers, the British government wanted this to happen. It was encouraged by a man named Tony Benn, who was acting as chairman of the Industrial Reorganization Committee, which was created by the first Wilson government. This was mostly for British Motor Holdings' benefit. They had a lot of brands, like I said, and the government didn't want to see any of those brands fall because it would seriously hurt their domestic manufacturing industry. Leyland was in really good shape, so the thought was that Leyland's management could effectively take over BMH and fix the problems, resulting in an overall improvement to the British economy, at least when it came to vehicle manufacturing. While this would of course create an absolute beast of a company, with tons of different brands and tons of infrastructure, they were hoping it would create what was in effect a British General Motors. Under their new chairman, Sir Donald Stokes, who had already been the chairman of Leyland, this new corporation would become the 5th largest vehicle manufacturer in the entire world, only beaten by General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, and Volkswagen. Because of their absolute gargantuan size, they had to be somewhat organized at least a little bit, so they were split into divisions, 7 of them. The first was Austin Morris, which was the volume car division, made up entirely of British Motor Corporation brands, like Austin, Morris, MG, Riley, and Wolseley. This division would handle your average car, the regular stuff that most people were looking for. There was a specialist division that focused on the sports and luxury brands, like Rover, Triumph, and Jaguar, meant more for the rich and fancy. There was Leyland Truck and Buses, which was pretty much just the original Leyland as they were, focusing on commercial vehicles like they were good at. Then there was Pressed Steel Fisher, or PSF, which was originally the Pressed Steel Company, which had been a subsidiary of BMH, and they made car body shells. There was Overseas, which was their satellite car manufacturing operations located around the world, Construction Equipment, which is exactly what it sounds like, as well as General Engineering and Foundries, which is just everything else, because they didn't just make cars. BMH had a lot of different brands under their roster, and those included things that were like refrigerators and metal casting, other avenues for the company to make money. But regardless, things were organized, everything had a place, and surely nothing could possibly go wrong. And then absolutely everything did. Immediately, a problem was discovered by Lord Stokes himself. He was, in fact, legitimately horrified to find out that BMH was in really bad shape, and it wasn't due to anything involved with the market necessarily. It was due to them being complete idiots. Now, it is important to understand that we were talking about car manufacturers this time, and in this market, things are a lot different when compared to a lot of the other companies I've talked about. Whenever you're manufacturing cars, you want a certain kind of appeal to, well, a lot of people. If you have multiple brands, they shouldn't compete with each other, only your actual competitors, and they should be updated regularly to entice more sales from old customers looking to replace their dated vehicles. Innovation and style are two of the major cornerstones in automobile manufacturing. You're selling to people, and regular people want two things: a car that functions and a car that they think at least looks nice. Depending on the kind of person we're talking about here, one of these things might be more important than the other, but regardless, they're both relatively important. And you certainly can't be selling the same exact car all the time, every day, for years, which is exactly what BMH had been doing. At the time of the merger, they still offered a whole range of vehicles, but they were exceedingly dated. They included the Morris Minor, which had been first introduced in 1948. Even some of their newer examples, like the Austin Cambridge and the Morris Oxford, dated back to 1959. Still kind of old, and even some of their newer vehicles really weren't helping them in any way. These included the Mini, which was a tremendously successful small vehicle. The reason these weren't helping was that they were underpriced. That sounds weird, because it sounds great for the customer, and yeah, they were. They were reliable vehicles at a really good price, but that meant that BMH wasn't really making hardly any money off of the sales, which is kind of important to keep the company functional. And on top of the low price point, they offered very generous warranties, so they often found themselves having to fix these cars that they already didn't make much money on. The point is, they were operating at a financial loss across the board. Lord Stokes could not believe how bad this was, and the only new models that BMH seemed interested in working on were really meant for very niche markets, like the Austin Maxi and the Austin 3-liter, the latter of which never sold hardly any. No one wanted that car whatsoever. They hadn't focused any of their attention on the development of new mass-market models, general-purpose cars that would appeal to a lot of people. They hadn't bothered to update those, and that meant their competitors could swoop in and take a lot of their potential customers away. Stokes knew this and was, to his credit, fairly good at his job. He was trying to manage something impossible to manage, but he did his best. He pushed to design and introduce mass-market models very quickly, brand new ones, in order to get a foothold in the modern market. The first result of which was the Morris Marina, which is a weird car to talk about because... Alright, so in the technical sense, the Marina sold really well. It was one of the strongest selling cars in the entire UK during the 70s, and the second most popular new car sold in Britain during 1973. But it had been rushed, as the case may be, and they had a lot of problems, and really poor longevity. They liked to rust really bad. Though a lot of people bought them, they often wound up hating them, and it hurt British Leyland's reputation. The Austin Allegro, which launched in 1973, also wasn't a particularly good car in the grand scheme of things. It probably didn't help that the actual function of the overall company was flawed in almost every conceivable way. It wasn't just that they weren't producing a decent vehicle to a mass market. That was obviously a problem, a major one. But it was also that they weren't functioning, at all. The workforce really just loved to strike. And it was much worse for British Leyland when this happened, because despite the fact that they had pretty much doubled their overall manufacturing capability as a result of the merger, with a duplication of many of their facilities, which for them in their particular field wasn't necessarily a bad thing, there were still a lot of single points of failure. Certain manufacturing facilities where, if those in particular were shut down, say as the result of a strike, then everything else ground to a halt, because they were the only things that made the parts that were needed to make everything else. And they never really got around duplicating those, which probably would have helped fix a lot of these strike issues, Because British Leyland wasn't the only one suffering from these frequent strikes. Ford and General Motors had to deal with that too, somewhat, at least in Britain. But to get around this issue, they had merged their previously separate British and German subsidiaries, as well as the product lines, which allowed them to source production from either the British or continental European plants in the event of a strike, since it was pretty unusual, if not nearly unheard of, for a strike to cross national lines. Basically, say your General Motors and your workers in Britain are striking. Well, you could still get the parts you need from, say, Germany. But British Leyland couldn't do this, and it was routinely kneecapping their manufacturing processes. As this went on, both Ford as well as Vauxhall would overtake British Leyland to become Britain's two best-selling brands. And this was about the time that a lot of Japanese manufacturers were starting to go, well, global. Companies like Nissan and Toyota were pushing their products across national lines, and we're starting to see an uptick in sales in places like Britain, not to mention other manufacturers just across the channel over in Europe. Fiat, Renault, and Volkswagen were significant threats, and were also achieving strong sales in the market. It got so bad that the UK government had to introduce protectionist measures in the form of import quotas, specifically on Japanese manufacturers, to protect their domestic producers. But this only slowed the bleeding. It didn't stop it. It's important to understand that British Leyland owned almost 40 manufacturing plants across the UK alone at their peak, but they were set up in such a way that made this, irrelevant. With any company, and in particular car manufacturers, you don't want to compete with yourself. What that means is you don't want two products that are going after the same market share. Let's take the Ford F-150, for example. It's one of the most popular trucks, and most of you probably know what it is. Now, Ford's had a lot of success with the F-150, but let's say at the same time they also made something like the F-150 that offered the same thing, but under a slightly different brand name or something. That's gonna hurt F-150 sales. And you might say, yeah, but aren't they making sales in the other thing? Yes, but because these things are different, it means you're adding to the cost of manufacturing. If you were just selling one on just one assembly line with the same parts every single time, that's going to make more money in the long run than two slightly different things that also happen to be going after the same market, purely because of the extra cost to manufacture both of these things for the same customer base. But the worst part was that BMH wasn't actually even really making cars that were all that different in some cases. They were making a lot of badge-engineered cars. A badge-engineered car is kind of a general term for a type of car that's made and sold under several different brands. They're rebadged to look a little bit different, but internally, they are the exact same car. Now, this could be beneficial in some cases, because it means you are using the same parts effectively each and every time, but you're still doing that compete with yourself thing, assuming your name is British Leyland. And they were. They never properly integrated either the dealer networks or the production facilities of Austin and Morris, who had been historic rivals and still didn't like each other even after the merger. While they were manufacturing basically identical cars, they were competing with each other and giving British Leyland twice the logistics to deal with, as well as marketing and distribution costs, all of which would be halved if they had just sold the thing under a single name, or if production of a single model platform was concentrated in just one of the factories, not both. And Austin and Morris was just an example of one of the rivalries that plagued British Leyland. A lot of the brands that had been acquired by both BMH and Leyland Motors had been historic rivals. That meant that under British Leyland's corporate umbrella, there was rivalry all over the place, with the individual brands trying to outcompete each other, even though they were all now the same company. They were eating themselves. A lot of the suits began to fight over this. Certain brands would actually attempt to sabotage other brands just to get a leg up. Again, they are now the same company. You guys are supposed to be working together. In military terms, it was friendly fire. Friendly fire all over the place. British Leyland overall dragged their feet on trying to rationalize all their model lines. They often had multiple models competing in the same market across the board, increasing production costs, logistics, the whole shebang. It was out of control because, in effect, they weren't standardizing anything. They weren't focusing on one market at a time and one car for each market. One car for each market, guys. You have to focus here and try to scale things down. But they had so many brands that it was pretty hard to convince some of them to, well, not make a car. As a result, British Leyland's marketing teams decided to try to push for more obvious distinctions between the different brands, to try to artificially imply that they were different or were good for a separate part of the market in order to increase sales. An example of this was pitching Morris as a maker of conventional mass market cars to compete directly with Ford and Vauxhall, and then pushing Austin to keep going with advanced family cars with front-wheel drive and fluid suspension. This led Morris to make the Marina and Austin to make the Allegro, two more distinctive vehicles that didn't necessarily compete with each other. And that sounds good, but the problem in this case was the dealership network. Whenever you're making cars, you have to remember the dealers. The dealers have to make their sales, and they have their own smaller markets to worry about, as well as a customer base. That network wasn't really in on the whole plan. So Austin and Morris dealers, which had historically been able to offer a full range of different vehicles, had their product selection halved, because the Marina and the Allegro were two separate things. And for the company itself, that was good, but for the dealers, this was awful. They couldn't actually cater to many of their previously loyal customers' tastes because they just didn't have as many options. And in some instances, it didn't even really help at all, because a lot of customers didn't necessarily see the distinction between the two. British Leyland also loved concepts, just so many concept cars. Which is great and all, but it was a waste of money when they were hemorrhaging that already all over the place. If you add all this together, you have what is a just divine mess of a car manufacturer conglomerate, and there were a lot of factors during the 70s that had nothing to do with them, but also made their situation worse, like the 1973 oil crisis, which meant people weren't driving as much, and as such, weren't buying cars as much. The company was effectively unmanageable, and crippled financially, to the point that Lord Stokes had to go directly to Tony Benn for assistance. And you know what? Tony, you wanted this. Fix it. Well, the government did try to fix it in their own way. A man named Sir Don Ryder was asked to undertake an inquiry into the position of British Leyland to figure out exactly what was wrong. And his report was presented to the government in April of 1975. I don't know exactly what the report said, but what I assume it said is that it was simply titled, "What's Wrong with British Leyland?" followed with the word everything. And nothing else. Except not really. He had some recommendations, and the government decided that they were going to make a very large investment into the company. The Labour government created a new holding company called British Leyland Limited, of which the government themselves were the major shareholder, and, in a sense, nationalized British Leyland. But not exactly in a traditional way. I'd compare it more to something like Conrail, where it was government-owned, but not necessarily government-run, strictly. They were still kind of on their own, but the government had a lot of pull. Whereas something like British Rail was directly government-managed, you know? So it's not exactly the same, but for all intents and purposes, they were a nationalized company. And this was done to try to save them because there were a lot of domestic jobs on the line. Many people worked for British Leyland and depended on them for a paycheck. The Labour government didn't want to see it all fall apart, especially since this was kind of all their fault to begin with. This was your idea. You did this. Between 1975 and 1980, the shares the government had were vested in the National Enterprise Board, which was responsible for managing that investment. And as part of BL's restructuring, the original 7 divisions were stripped down to just 4. Leyland Cars, for their generic cars, Leyland Truck and Bus, which focused on the commercial vehicle market, Leyland Special Products, which had the things like construction equipment and refrigerators, and Leyland International, which focused on the export market. And at first, things kind of started getting better, believe it or not. At the end of 1976, they introduced their new Rover SD1 executive car, and it was voted the European Car of the Year. It was good. It was innovative, stylish for the time, and people really liked it. And it was also a good step to standardize that element of the market, as it replaced 2 previously competing cars, the Rover P6 and the Triumph 2000. The government would also approve the investment of £140 million of public money, yes, taxpayer dollars, to refit the Long Bridge plant for the production of the new ADO 88, which was to replace their old classic Mini. That was due for launch in 1979, but it was delayed because there was poor results from test markets. People just didn't like it. So they redesigned the whole thing, which evolved into what was known as the LC8, and eventually launched as the Austin Mini Metro, which was ultimately a successful car. In 1977, Michael Edwards was appointed the new chief executive of the company by the NEB. Edward would reverse one of the policies influenced by the government of giving prominence to the Leyland branding, instead focusing back to the individual brands. Leyland Cars was renamed to just BL Cars, and consisted of two main divisions, Austin Morris and Jaguar Rover Triumph, or JRT. But in 1978, they suffered a class action lawsuit because they decided that it was a really good idea to not recall one of their Allegro models, which had a known defect in the wheel bearings. This could cause potential accidents and injuries and possible death, but they decided not to recall because they felt that the costs of the recall were in proportion with the potential risks of injury, which is objectively horrifying. Why would you ever do that? It not only cost them a lot of money, but it made them look really bad. Regardless of that, though, they did start doing pretty well into the 1980s, delivering some genuinely good cars. But the success wasn't necessarily enough to fix all their problems. They were still in dire straits, and some of their factories started to be closed down in order to save money. Michael Edwards' tenure as chairman ended in 1982, and by that point, the whole company was restructured into two distinct parts. The Cars division, which is exactly what it sounds like, and the Commercial Vehicle division. They were run by two different chief executives, so it was almost like British Leyland had become this weird two-headed giant. Though, to be fair, the heads didn't exactly argue, because they were focused on completely different things. The holding company was then chaired by Austin Bide, though he was in a non-executive capacity, and British Leyland Cars Limited then made the odd decision to rename themselves Austin Rover. This new name, and therefore new brand, put an end to the separate Austin Morris and Jaguar Rover Triumph divisions. And Jaguar, in particular, wasn't even really a part of the company anymore. They were residing in a separate company called Jaguar Car Holdings, and that would be de-merged from British Leyland completely and privatized again in 1984. That same year, both Morris and Triumph, as brands, were shelved, leaving behind only the Austin and Rover brands. During the 1980s, they'd also chosen to ally with a Japanese manufacturer, Honda, in order to provide new cars that would benefit both companies, which did actually do that, but over time this would just kind of weaken British Leyland overall. BL would change their name entirely to just the Rover Group, and their trucks division and Leyland Vehicles would merge with the Dutch DAF company to form DAF NV. The bus business was later spun off into a new company called Leyland Bus, and that had been the result of a management buyout, who decided to sell the company to the bus and trunk division of Volvo in 1988. Everything about British Leyland, or Rover Group, was slowly coming apart, and the UK government even tried to privatize and sell off Land Rover, but that was later abandoned. Austin, as a brand, was later dropped in order to push more towards the Rover branding. And in 1988, the entire business was sold by the UK government to British Aerospace, but then they would turn around and sell it to BMW, who, after several years of investment, found that the company was still losing money, so they broke up Rover Group and only retained the Cali operations, as well as the rights to manufacture the new Mini family of vehicles. Land Rover was sold to Ford, who integrated it with their premier automotive group, which by that point encompassed Jaguar again, so they kind of reunified them in a way. But Ford themselves would start to suffer financial problems and decided to dissolve their premier automotive group, selling off most of those brands. The Jaguar and Land Rover were sold to the Indian automaker, Tata Motors, at the end of 2008. To the present day, the only surviving manufacturing operations of British Leyland are the Mini, Jaguar Land Rover, and Leyland Trucks. What an absolutely insane story. In the end, you kind of almost have to feel bad for Leyland. Not British Leyland, just Leyland. Because Leyland Motor Corporation prior to the merger was a good company and doing well. But they hitched their wagon to British Motor Holdings, and everything just went downhill completely and catastrophically. But if there's anything good to say about British Leyland, they did try. It took them too long to fix a lot of their issues, but they did start making good cars for a while. Some of those vehicles are considered classics, especially over in the UK. It seems more than anything that this company was just too big for its own good. Yeah, maybe a large merger sounds like a company should be making a lot of money, but if you mismanage absolutely every element of it, you're gonna lose money. All the time. Constantly. Which is what British Leyland pretty much wound up doing. Also, can we just talk about how this was the UK government's idea? This was your call, guys. You encouraged this, and look what happened. Your automotive industry exploded. I've got on record saying that sometimes the government can help. Over here in America, Conrail was a good example. But in this instance, no, you weren't helping. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Jack Carson's Road Videos, Lord Off 444, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Red Lion, NS Productions 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Andrew Bowen, Josh Johnson, Caleb Rainwaters, Prez Drenton, Master of None, Travis Walensky, Jared Brussel, JBL Explorers, Tommy Rossini, Ben McCullough, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mark Holding, G Wiz, Mr. Terrevel, Hayden DeGrow, Metal for Life Guy, No, Kurt Forkham, Ohio Trucker 1, Mr. Sleepy, DM Trouble Typhoon, Harry, Drew Debris, George Kenny, Kevin Wood, Liam Wright, Morris Tillman Productions, NJ 1969, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Hannah Bird, Western Colorado History, AET Museum, Ryan Wehofer, Deroushi, Murder Drone Stall, Willier Conklin, Windy City Rails, A-Person 723, William Nemo, Dr. Racer 78, Shimesu, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fun farewell.